Hello and welcome to SAM Conversations. Our topic of discussion today is Afghanistan. And the question that we are seeking to examine is very, very fundamental. Is Afghanistan governable? And this becomes even more relevant against the backdrop of the very tragic attack that took place on Tuesday, the 2nd of November, when a military hospital was attacked by the Islamic State Khorasan, and it led to the death of a large number of Afghan patients, detainees, not detainees, but those who were admitted in the hospital for care. Patients would be more appropriate. So this is the most brutal kind of attack that you target a hospital, the most vulnerable institution in any country. But this is just an indicator about the multiple challenges that Afghanistan is facing. Some of it has been brought under the umbrella of the 4Cs. C as in conflict, which is raging even as we speak. C as in COVID and the pandemic and its challenges. C as in climate change and all that it means for the average Afghan citizen. And finally, C as in a cash crunch. The country is going through a very severe crisis, which impacts the daily lives of the local people. And against this backdrop, I think the principal stakeholders who have been involved in the affairs of Afghanistan have a very major challenge. And to help us to really review this question, I'm very happy to introduce and welcome Professor Omar Sadr. He is currently an assistant professor at the American University in Afghanistan, Kabul, and also concurrently a research fellow at the University of Pittsburgh. An accomplished scholar at a relatively young age. I'm also happy to add that he is a graduate of the South Asian University, one of the many accomplished scholars who finished his PhD here in Delhi at the SAU, author of 6 books and more. Welcome to the chat, Professor Sadr.
It's my pleasure, Bhaskar sir. Thank you for having me.
So why don't we get straight into the discussion, and perhaps you could help us to answer the first kind of issue that comes up, which is that after this attack and what the Islamic State now poses to the Taliban, I mean, there is a double irony here. Earlier, it was the Taliban that was seen as the perpetrator of such attacks. And now they are on the receiving end in a very tragic way. So what do you make as someone who's an Afghan national, who knows the country, and I'm sure who's anguished like all of us? What do you make of Afghanistan, and can it be really, is it governable? Omar?
Thank you so much. So let me dwell a bit with this concept of governance in context of Afghanistan. I think we have come across this question multiple times in last 20 years at least, as the US and the West was engaged in Afghanistan, and the way they imagined or reimagined the project of nation building or state building. And at the moment that Taliban has taken over since 15th of August, again, I think this is one of the critical questions, but let me rephrase this in other terms. And I think another question could be whether Taliban can govern instead of whether Afghanistan is governable. Because of course, historically, the modern Afghanistan formed since 1880s so far had experienced multiple forms of governance and statehood, multiple types of political system. But beyond the nation state, of course, since if you look at the middle centuries, Afghanistan had played the area geography, which currently we call it Afghanistan, had played a predominant role in terms of formation of empires, which ruled and governed the region, ranging from Ghazni till Herat, till Balkh, till Kabul, and of course, areas like Kashmir and Punjab. So of course, I think in terms of governance now, in the modern times, governance has been rephrased extensively. It is not just about formal institutions and state structures, but of course, it's beyond that, and it's somehow a nexus between society on one hand and state on the other hand, and how state and citizens interact with each other. It extends beyond the rules and actions of public sector and institutions or processes, and it is somehow how we, in terms of governance, we look at how society organizes itself. And in that sense, even if Afghanistan does not have a strong state in terms of its institution, yes, of course, that's acknowledgeable. However, traditionally, society had certain informal mechanisms to govern itself. So, for example, scholars like Jennifer Murtazashvili has extensively researched on rule of informal institutions in terms of governance. There's a kind of paradox between formal institutions that has been imposed from above, either by elites or international actors like Soviet Union or United States, and informal dynamics of the society. I think one of the key challenges of governance in Afghanistan has been that one, because the aim was to build a centralized state from above, but a society traditionally has organized itself in a very informal, decentralized manner, wherein there were social institutions, informal of course, which allowed people to govern themselves in an autonomous manner. The way
That's a very good point. If I could just briefly interrupt you here, I think this is again a very pertinent observation, that maybe we should rephrase this and say, can the Taliban govern?
Yeah.
Mainly because of their own trajectory, where the Taliban started in the madrasas of Pakistan, and their own 20-25 year experience, both with violence and with the ideology that they espouse. But since you make reference to structures of society and the informal nature of governance that had been in practice for decades, if not a century plus, would you say that after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which is during the Cold War, and the more recent experience of the United States led global war on terror and what it has done both to the Afghan state and Afghan society, we are now, I think, reasonably agreed that the Taliban does not exude the credibility of a state.
Yeah.
But the current structures of society, are they resilient enough to be able to pick up what they could do in the past? Or the current observation of the global community is that if you do not allow women and girls to participate in the way they did over the last 15-20 years, since we've seen literacy going up, the young girls and the young women of Afghanistan and what they have done in various sectors, if that is going to be completely now denied, that's just one example. Is society able to play the role it did in the past in terms of governance?
Now Taliban, it's a kind of old insurgency. It has been there with us almost, I think, since 1994 and 96, when the first time they captured Kabul. And when they entered the seventh phase of insurgency post-2001, and from that time onwards, parallel, they were engaged in warfare, but at the same time, they were exercising certain level of governance at the rural areas, where they had certain form of control and dominance. Now, what has been changed? The fact is that now Taliban are not just governing or controlling the rural areas, but they have come up to Kabul, the capital, and other major cities, which are fundamentally and qualitatively different from the rest of the society. So now they have faced young, educated, civil activists, for instance, a middle-class society in Kabul, Balkh, Jalalabad, Herat, and then they also have to now adopt formal institutions. Earlier, they were using informal institutions, for example, like Jirga or Shura, or certain other informal ways to rule and govern people. But now they have to transform from an insurgency to an state agency and be responsible to deliver services, security, justice, and all that. Now, of course, Taliban are incapable of these because they have never had the experience, both in terms of manpower, the capacity, in terms of human resources. Taliban leadership is exclusively mullahs, a bunch of mullahs, graduates of Deobandi madrasas, who doesn't have any idea what is a statecraft. They just know what is the traditional understanding of their religion. That's number one. And secondly, they didn't have the experience in the last 20 years how to use, for example, state institutions, how to provide services, how to run and govern financial issues and banking system, let's say, and so on and so forth. So in that case, I must say, Taliban are brutally ruling and suppressing, but not governing, because governance is not just top-down suppressing of the people. Of course, you can beat, imprison, kill, and through that you can control a society. But at the modern times, governance is not about beating and imprison, torturing, and very medieval way of perspective towards governance. So now, to what extent, coming to your point about to what extent society and these informal institutions may show resilience, that I think that will also again differ in terms of whether we are talking in a rural context or an urban context, right? Now, to a large extent, I may say institutions at the urban context has been damaged since the time Taliban took over. For example, you see many of these institutions falling apart. For example, let me say a large number of NGOs, non-governmental institutions, civil society organizations, which were factional last 18 years in the major cities, right, at urban centers. Now I see and I have conversation with some of my friends back in Kabul, and I just count how many institutions has fallen apart. So whether it's these institutions were offering educational services, right? They were active in some certain form of community engagement, right?
So primary health, providing food, I think all
Right.
these things, the reports we are seeing are suggesting that they have
Right.
become they have collapsed basically. So
They have
I think,
collapsed.
go ahead. No, I'm saying my observation really is that whatever you read and see in the last few weeks, the situation is distressing. One fears, particularly for the vulnerable cross section, which is young children, babies, mothers, all of them, and with the winter months likely to become even more harsh. So this really leads me to my second kind of area for our discussion. There have been so many conferences. We talk about the troika after the United States has left, which is Russia, Pakistan, China, and perhaps with a little bit of participation by Iran, which is troika +1. Do you think that these four countries can make any kind of difference to governance as far as Taliban, or even forget governance, dealing with the humanitarian challenge? And in the same breath, let me add, Delhi is hosting a meeting of the National Security Advisors on the 10th of November. Would that make, again, any difference to the humanitarian challenge? Because I think we are, again, very distressed that Pakistan is not allowing the wheat, which is India is willing to provide immediately, to make the transit. So these countries, those who consider themselves part of the closer group, well-wishers like India, can they play any role to alleviate or in any way contribute to the humanitarian crisis? Omar?
Well, in terms of forums at the regional level, which has been, for example, by Russians, as presented as alternatives to the Western-led processes, my observation is that, unfortunately, because of a very deep and level of divergence of interests amongst the countries in the region, you see parallel processes are coming up. And the last one was, of course, the one which was Summit of Minister of Foreign Affairs in Tehran, wherein Lavrov clearly said that we should avoid creating parallel institutions and structures and processes, and instead try to complement each other. And that clearly shows that, for example, to what extent Troika is there, but at the same time, Iranians are interested to initiate an alternative process, and many others also in the region. I think what unified most of the countries in the region, including China, Russia, and the Iranians, were, of course, to have a de-American region, and or somehow try to push for the Americanization of the region. But from the day after Americans' withdrawal, they didn't have a common interest. And it will be somehow quite difficult for them to contribute either in terms of establishing order in Afghanistan, but also controlling of a humanitarian crisis because of simple reason. First of all, it requires immense resources. And most of these countries, you see that they don't have the capacity or I think willingness, political will to invest lots of resources. For example, let's say to what extent, what is the amount of Chinese donation in terms of humanitarian to the Taliban occupied Kabul? So it's quite not substantial,
yeah.
right? So that's in terms of capacity, in terms of political will, but also in terms of to what extent they can come together to present a certain form of joint platform. A third challenge, and I will come with this to India, as I think, to my understanding, is a level of right-wing nationalism in most of these countries, wherein it has not allowed certain form of cooperation. For example, humanitarian aid may not include just supply of food or, for example, assistance in terms of assisting with hunger and other things, but also may, for example, include provision of emergency visas, evacuations, and all that. And in the last 2 months, for example, I observed that how India failed to do that, right? Because the dominant ruling party in India is afraid of, for example, granting extensive visa for Afghanistan, those who in Afghanistan who had been friendly with India, and they were denied of that of visa, at least entrance to India.
My sense is that this is the kind of issue would be discussed, I think, in the meeting at the National Security Advisors level, because I am aware that there has been a lot of deliberation about this, mainly because, as you know, historically, there is the link that India has had with Afghanistan going back to the Soviet invasion and subsequently. And yes, I think, they are looking at the numbers and what can be done. But I'm sure you're aware, Professor Sadr, that wherever there has been a certain, for instance, say students who needed to get an extension of their visas and so on, has been done. So I think there is an attempt. But let me ask you, just take this forward a little bit. Sitting where you are now in the US, you're able to observe, what is happening in Afghanistan. And I think the concern for everyone is, what is the way ahead? So as an academic, as a scholar, what would you identify for the policymaker globally? After all, the United States repeatedly has said that it has not abandoned Afghanistan, that they are still trying to come up with an Afghan plan. But we are aware of the differences within the United Nations Security Council, where China and Russia have very divergent views. So if you have any thoughts on suggestions for the global policy maker, what would you prioritize? Omar?
A number of things. Let me highlight first. I think we need to address the very critical humanitarian crisis.
That's number one, clearly.
Catastrophe in Afghanistan. We need to come up with certain mechanisms how to deliver aid, how to open a safe corridor for those who are at risk in Afghanistan, and how to, for example, international organizations like United Nations or local NGOs play a role. While we do this, we need to be cautious of the fact that we shall not reinforce the brutal, barbaric Taliban rule in Afghanistan. That's number one. Second is, I think, some sort of moral responsibility that international community has with respect to Afghanistan, but also with the way they deal with the ex-corrupt politicians and bureaucrats of Afghanistan. For example, most recently, University of Harvard accepted Ajmal Ahmadi, who was the ex-central bank governor in Afghanistan, as a research fellow. While we know to what extent this top leadership of the ex-government, the Republic, they have been responsible for the failure and collapse of the Republic. Now, I cannot understand why universities like Harvard, which is well established, are morally not cautious of the way they bring back these corrupt elite in different forms. And this is not just limited to universities. You see how, for example, ex-elites have been treated in different forms. So there is a sense of moral responsibility should be there, not just in terms of assisting humanitarian crisis or addressing humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, but also the way that we interact with both the Taliban and the ex-corrupt leaders. That's the second. Third is, of course, the way we need to come up, the world should come up with a clear agenda. How do we deal with the Taliban? Now, unfortunately, almost everyone, the way so much damage has been done by the US special envoy in Afghanistan and the way he painted and presented in a package the Taliban, and it's and even now he repeatedly says that, well, Taliban respects the last interview that he had, respects freedom of media and free expression and allows girls education. That's not the way Afghanistan.
You're talking about Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, right?
Zalmay Khalilzad, right? Yes, exactly. So I think we need to have a clear knowledge of the way and Taliban governs, and they are an insurgent / terrorist / very genocidal group who just now, through use of force and through a deal, they have controlled Afghanistan. So, well, many propose at this moment that we don't have any other option except to come into some terms with the Taliban and just practically need to recognize the facts. That's, I think, the perspective that both Taliban and their patrons are suggesting.
Well, sitting where you are in Pittsburgh, in the University of Pittsburgh, I hope that you can make some kind of a public intervention, because even here in India, those who are following developments in Afghanistan are very concerned, because as you are aware, over the last 20 years since 9/11, India has made an investment of more than $3 billion as far as the Afghan people and institutions, parliament, etc. are concerned. And we watch with dismay and distress as to what is happening. The safe corridor that you speak about, for instance, whether it is under UNAGs or otherwise, will need some degree of, I would say, cooperation, not only with the Taliban, but with Pakistan, which regrettably is playing the spoiler's role. But what I will do is, Professor Sadr, towards the end, can I request you to share your thoughts about the Islamic State Khorasan? Because even as you have described the Taliban as a group that has all these characteristics that involve terrorism, they've been guilty of genocide and various other excesses, they are now on the ropes, in relation to the Islamic State Khorasan. So how do you see this unraveling, evolving in the near future? Will the ISK become even more potent as a terrorist organization and thereby threaten the region than what we have seen in the past? Or do you think the Taliban would be able to, deal with the ISK? Professor Sadr?
Well, I don't think Taliban would be able to deal with the ISK or manage that one. There are, I think, enough reasons to say that ISK will present an existential challenge, if not now, and very near future, to the Taliban governance and rule. Number one is, I think, poverty, which draws many who are struggling to win a bread for their families, wherein in certain regions, ISK has offered people and ex-army soldiers, for example, ex-NDSF, the reports are there, to join ISK in exchange of 500 bucks per month. So that's a good incentive economically. That's number one. Second, as I think, lack of Taliban capacity in terms of governance, in terms of service delivery, and in terms of many other aspects, in terms of establishing security, law and order. So this will allow, as people will be dissatisfied already, majority, predominantly the northerners, the Persians, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks and Hazaras are the ones who are dissatisfied with the Taliban rule, and they don't have any other alternative.
Sure. So
probably they will be recruited, and that's second. Third is, of course, a degree of radicalization. Now, many extremists, particularly Salafis, and those who were with very fundamentalist thinking within the Taliban rank, and now they see the Taliban, for example, in certain areas, they are going flexible. Or they are not implementing very hardline religious policies in certain extents, for example. So they are getting this.
Letting girls go back to school, I'm told, is causing a lot of, this, I would say, discord within the extremists or among the Taliban also.
Exactly. Or for example, earlier Taliban were concerned about the level of the length of beard or clothing, for example, or music, or for example, wedding halls. Now, certain things are okay with some of these Taliban. So that has also dissatisfied those radical factions. So they will shift their allegiance from the Taliban to a much more radical faction. Now, the void is there. You have the Taliban, and then you have people who are suffering from hunger, who are culturally, ideologically dissatisfied with the Taliban. Now, they don't have any other alternatives. So what they will do, of course, ISKP.
This is a vicious cycle. It reminds you of what happened in Iraq, when the Ba'athist regime had been removed. But Professor Sadr, I think I want to thank you, first of all, for walking us through some very, very complex issues related to Afghanistan. And you bring the perspective of someone who knows his own country very well.
Thank you.
And I hope that we'd be able to invite you again, maybe in the course of the next few months. And we all hope and wish that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. But as a security analyst, I must share with some sadness that the light, if it is there, looks very dim. And I only hope that whatever deliberations are taking place in Delhi next week under the umbrella of the National Security Advisors, where Russia will also be present, and also the Central Asian states, may provide some alternative to the safe corridor and the other suggestions that you have made, so that if nothing, lives are not lost for lack of food, medicines, and all the immediate human survival kind of indicators that we need. On that note, allow me to thank you, Professor Sadr, for sharing your thoughts. And as I said, I hope that we would be able to make this request to you again.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to have this conversation with you, and I hope to reconnect back with Sam and South Asia Monitor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to SAM Conversations. We'll be back again with another subject very soon.